All right, thanks, Tom. Good morning, everybody. First of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today. Quick overall background, 20-year Air Force veteran, career security forces officer, served multiple deployments and time overseas, focused on law enforcement, security, force protection, anti-terrorism. But then towards the end of my career, started moving into the emergency management realm. Something that interested me a great deal, and something that I realized I would never be out of work, and that seems to continue to prove true. Retired from the Air Force in 2014. Worked with the Navy for 3 years on a fire safety program, coordinating with local fire departments and ship's force for fire drills and things of that nature. And then started with VDEM in 2018. As their training, education, exercise division director. And then about a year and a half later, the opportunity for the Disaster Services Bureau Chief came open, and applied and got it. So I've been doing this since July of 19, which, I got my feet wet for a little while, and then we quickly went into COVID and did that for a couple of years. So I still joke that I'm trying to figure out what my real job is. From the pre-COVID years, which I think not necessarily irrelevant, but it's just a whole new environment. But the part I enjoy is the fact that it's always something different, and the ability to work with multiple stakeholders is to me is a privilege, and this project is really no different.
Very good. So John, first up, why, from your perspective, why was this project of interest to Virginia?
So there's two visible signs of either progress or failure during a disaster. One of them are debris piles, and they start stacking up and then they need to go away. And the other one are whether or not the lights are on. So anything that aids in getting power back on, or getting power to certain areas that then help a large group of people or are community-based, that is always of interest to us. So when this was briefed to us a couple of years ago now, I think Curtis Brown was our state coordinator at the time. This definitely had a lot of merit, and so it's like, yeah, this is something we're interested in. If we can, the overall concept when it was, I say pitched to us, but when we were briefed on it, like I said, certainly piqued our interest, because any opportunity where we can responsibly help out large communities of people in a short amount of time is always going to be of interest to us on a broad scale.
Okay. From your perspective, what were some of the challenges that the state faced with the BRIC program? Right, this has been out; it's really its second, almost third year now. But can you talk to maybe some of the challenges that we're facing states and communities in doing these infrastructure type projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you stated, BRIC is fairly new. I think the first time I had been briefed on it was FEMA Administrator Gaynor came to Virginia, and this would have been late 2020, 2021. And he was briefing on it, and we all kind of heard about it, but it was fairly new. So anytime you have something new, it's you got to get your arms wrapped around it. You got to figure what the overall intent is. You got to then figure out, with any grant project, you're competing for money, right? So you've got to be able to successfully say why you need the money more than someone else who also needs it, why you need it more. So trying to be able to fit what we were trying to do. So you got a new grant, you got a new technology, newish technology, new application of that, trying to merge that together and then figure out, okay, how are we best going to serve the community, the communities, and I'm focused obviously on Virginia, how are we going to best serve that? So trying to match all those up and fit it into the FEMA system. So it's almost, square peg round hole situation where, okay, they've got a benefit cost analysis formula that we've got to try to match up to score well. But the things that we were looking at wasn't necessarily a direct translation. Our grant staff could certainly get into the details on that a lot better than I could, but it was really the ability to kind of paint the picture and tell the story of when we started to drill down and figure out where we wanted to apply this technology, to then be able to answer, well, why are you going there? Why are you picking this location versus that location? And that doesn't necessarily translate well to a pie chart or a bar graph or something that can be easily represented. It's a narrative of, well, we're going to go to this dialysis center because it's in a community that has a high elderly population. And if that doesn't have power, 3 days later, that entire community is now going to the local emergency room, which the hospital scores well. They already have it generated. But now I'm overwhelming a hospital that is now being overwhelmed because the disaster created issues that caused the power to go out, right? So it's one of those, like, you really got to start peeling that onion back and making it relevant and it finally wraps around to, here's why we've picked this location, for this particular project. So that's probably been the biggest challenge is being able to quantify something that is really best told in narrative format.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about, John, also from the resource standpoint? We talk about that, right? The infrastructure projects are very different than typical mitigation projects, right? When you're dealing with power, comms, and things like that. Can you talk about some of the resource constraints facing states, maybe especially the disadvantaged communities who have to kind of put in for this stuff?
So especially your underserved populations are typically in underserved counties and even cities in some case, Petersburg being a good example. And so when you're applying for grants, they don't have the manpower, the skill set, the time necessarily to be able to put all that information together. A lot of these places are typically one deep emergency management shops. But as we know, when we put this together, I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, the number of stakeholders involved in this and the number of folks that have to come to the table to provide that information and get buy-in, that's a huge undertaking. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, and with a pretty well-resourced state and a well-resourced private sector, but bringing that all together, those are some of the resource constraints that we run into, is that the people, the skill sets, and the time to be able to put that together to write the grant. And we just had a state Homeland Security grant stakeholder meeting. Today's Friday, Wednesday, where we brought a bunch of stakeholders in, right? And that grant's been going on for a long time, so we knew the scoring and we knew how to get things in there. But we also had a lot of people in the room that had practiced this and done it before, but we're constantly trying to recruit and train and educate the communities that don't have the ability to write the grant that probably need it the most. That's probably one of our biggest constraints.
Right. You also mentioned the community selection process. Could I ask you, maybe, how did you determine? I know you linked it back to COVID studies and so forth. Can you talk about that just for a minute? How did you pick these communities, underserved versus ones that weren't?
So during COVID, Virginia Department of Health had hired a company to come in and help with the health equity look at the best way to distribute PPE, the best way to distribute vaccines, and who do we need to go to first. And for several years, FEMA has been involved in making sure that they're identifying typically marginalized and underserved communities. So it all really kind of came together during COVID. And I think it was Deloitte that put the list together. I would be remiss if I was trying to explain their methodology, because there are a lot of smart people in the room that put that together. But at the end of the day, we had a list that was data-driven, defensible. If someone was like, well, why this community versus that community? And, it looked at multiple factors, population, median income, access to healthcare, access to, food, transportation, right? There's a lot of factors that went into that in creating that. And they based it on population. They also based it on percentage of population. So we had kind of a hybrid list that really captured not just your high population centers, but also your rural communities. So when this project was presented, We have an Office of Diversity, Opportunity, and Inclusion, which now falls within our Community Outreach division, which is in our Communications division. They took a look at that list because I wanted to make sure, hey, this worked well for health equity. Does it also work well for what we're trying to do here? And the answer was yes. And I'll say we updated it. We validated it using some more updated information. A lot of the 2020 census tract data goes into this. We've got a couple of folks that have access. Well, a lot of us have access. A lot of it's public information, but we can go in there, take a look at the data, translate that to actionable information, and then say, yeah, this community versus that community makes sense. So good lessons learned from COVID. We use that to determine where we put our community vaccination centers. And we used a very similar method to do this, overlaid with, at the time, for now, overlaid with the Dominion footprint, and then overlaid with, some communities that wanted to participate. So we put it through a couple of filters, but at the end of the day, I think we still ended up with a good product.
Right. John, can you also maybe talk about the process internally? How did you organize internally to gather information? I think that would be helpful for folks to know. I know there was a partnership. We were all working together, but can you talk about from the state side, how did you guys organize internally to support kind of the capture of information?
So working on this project fell pretty well within the model that we use for disaster response, disaster recovery. In the Disaster Services Bureau, in my bureau, we have regional staff. So we have 7 geographic regions throughout the Commonwealth. So those are the staff that work day to day with the local emergency managers. One of the other bureau chiefs is the chief financial officer, and they have the grant staff. And so the grant staff and the regional staff are constantly married up together because that's where we take federal money and pass it through to the locality. So that is a well-worn path of communication and collaboration on a daily basis. So this just naturally fit into that, of including our grant staff, Debbie Mesmer, Alex Krupp, and Robbie Coates and his team, linking up with our regional staff. So initially I was given the task of, hey, John, you're the point of contact for VDEM. And that part was fairly easy, right? Like, I'm going to bring in the grant staff, I'm going to bring in the regional staff. We're going to explain this and go through it. Then the next, so that was, I won't say a challenge, but anytime you're trying to inform people on something that's new, there's a lot of questions. Why are we doing this? How are we going to execute this? Because those folks are the doers and the boots on the ground. So they immediately go into identifying a problem, but then go into problem solving mode. We weren't quite into those details yet. But as this progressed, it was, okay, we're all synced up between the consortium, Dominion, and the state. Now we're going to involve the locals. And that's what our regional staff do every day is, okay, now let's pull in the localities. Now that we're all on board and rowing in the same direction, now let's talk to the localities and let them know what we're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be executed at the local level. One of, you could call it disaster emergency management doctrine. All disasters are local. So you eventually have to get it to the local level to make it successful. So that was kind of our internal organization to start making that happen.
John, internally, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Internally, was there, it seemed from the outside, once people saw the product, they kind of got it. Were there any hurdles that internally you all faced with regards to taking something like this on, or a partnership with the utility, or were there any internal things, either regulatory or issues or optics that you had to overcome internally as you got ready to do this?
Not really. Any hurdles were kind of the normal hurdles of I'm trying to communicate something to a larger group and making sure everyone, I know what I said, but I don't know what they heard, right? So it's making sure that everyone was on the same page. And we, and you guys were on, a lot of the calls, right? Of, you said the same thing over and over again, but there was always someone that might have heard something different. So that's kind of a challenge we face no matter what. The other part was the consortium that couldn't necessarily write the grant, right? We had to have the VDEM grant staff write the grant and put that in. So to make sure that we were working together to get the right information to the grant staff so they could put that in and get it submitted on time. Then that just becomes kind of a project coordination and meeting timelines and milestones. But I wouldn't say there was anything unusual about some of the challenges we faced. I would say they were kind of normal challenges. I'd be interested to pose that question to my regional staff and the grant staff separately to see what answer they come up with, because I'm sure they would have a little bit more detailed answer there. But no, I think it was fairly normal challenges that we typically work through.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I know externally we had a lot of writers going on, and I think that was given to VDEM, and I think there was a transpose exercise had to happen, to put it into FEMA's system. It was an education, to say the least. All good though, all good. So from an operations standpoint, can you talk for a second how you envision this to help the disadvantaged communities, right? As we looked at the history, a lot of ice storms, tropical storm, ice storm, which issues flooding and power outages like that. Can you give us your perspective of how you see this helping the disadvantaged communities during an incident?
Sure. So, one, we're pretty excited about it. We're very optimistic about this project, and it gives us, not to oversimplify it, but it certainly gives us another tool in the toolbox when it comes to power restoration. Being able, because it involves a great deal of work on the front end, I think the optics are great, right? We've included the local emergency managers and the local governments because they know their communities the best, and all the way down to a local facility owner, and explaining what we're trying to do and get that buy-in early, right? And that word starts to permeate, and just kind of increases that public confidence and that goodwill, even before the power's gone out. If it's a situation where we got a hurricane coming and we've got a little bit of lead time, ideally, I'd like to see it where we're pre-deploying this technology to pre-identified facilities, so we don't have to try to do it right after a hurricane when roads are closed. And we've done that with generators. We did it, in fact, recently, one of the ice storms last year, where the locality said, hey, my pump station generator's really old, and they put the request in for the generator before the storm. And so this would give us an opportunity to develop some strategies based on what threat we're facing to potentially pre-deploy these to where they need to go. So when inevitably the power does go out, we've got pre-identified, and I'll use the term critical facilities, critical to that locality, that neighborhood, that community, that, hey, the lights are on, and I can go over to, my dialysis center is still working. My grocery store, I can walk over there and still get some food. That cooling center is up and running. That warming center is up and running. And even though the power might be out elsewhere, there's that little oasis there that I can always go to. I'll take temporary comfort over prolonged misery, right? So it's one of those, I can go there and get a little bit of relief, and it shows progress, right? Again, that visible, like, hey, we got the lights on here, and I don't want to speak for the utilities, but it probably takes a little bit of burden off them as they're running through their priority list of like, okay, that spot's taken care of for the next 48 hours. I can concentrate here and get power up and running elsewhere, because I know they're completely stretched thin and pulling in resources, all across the country to get things up and running. And I see them all the time on the highways with, out-of-state plates coming in to help each other out, or heading out of state when the disaster's somewhere else. So certainly, see a tremendous amount of utility of getting that power back on, or getting it on a little bit earlier to, again, show that, yep, we're making progress. We've worked with you. We realize this is important to you, whatever that community is. And again, it just helps, big picture, helps foster that public trust. And it shows that we are working together to get things back on. 24 hours sooner is huge. Or even, like I said, even if it's just temporary, I don't necessarily need my lights while the sun's up, but if I get the lights back on before the sun goes down, I'm a lot happier and I see that progress. But yeah, working with those communities at goodwill and public trust early on, and then actually seeing the execution of it, going, hey, this really did work. That's going to continue. That word's going to spread, and I see this growing and expanding as we prove that we can pull this off.
Yeah, John, one of the other pieces that was interesting about the grant is these underserved communities are typically more dependent, right, upon infrastructure being restored quicker, government and so forth. And a lot of attention was given to kind of the ancillary benefits, right? Mental health, load on local emergency managers, right? Can you speak to that for a minute? That was a new one for us. We hadn't really considered that.
Yeah, and those are those, we call the second, third order effects that, again, are hard to capture in a business cost analysis, and but those are the things that when you're face to face with people, that's the feedback that you get. But if I'm a local emergency manager, and and I've got areas of concern because I know that this particular community has this list of needs when the power goes out, but now I can make sure that the power is still on. That becomes that's a significant mental relief for the emergency manager, because now I can focus on other things. But again, the folks that know that it's there, that brings their stress level down a little bit, right? Because sometimes you worry about, well, where am I going to get food? Where am I going to go? How am I going to live through this 90-degree heat wave, or how am I going to deal with freezing cold temperatures? But if I know that, well, that shelter will be open, that grocery store will be open, that cooling center will be open. If I know that ahead of time, that kind of takes a little bit of stress off me as an individual, and those are things that are tough to measure.
Yeah. John, the last question, I know we got about 15 minutes left. The last question was, where do you see or hope this kind of goes? Right, this was an innovation on a number of fronts, but from your perspective, where do you and VDEM see where you'd like to see this go over maybe the next 3, 4, 5 years?
A couple different directions. We'd love to ideally have a huge repository of the batteries, right, and spread out throughout the state so they're easily accessible when we need them, but also see them throughout the Commonwealth, right, in the more rural areas, in the areas where you've got not just the Dominion footprint, but all the co-ops throughout the state, and because each community has different needs.
Right.
When we were out in Buchanan for the flooding, obviously there was the people that were impacted due to the flooding, and power was out because the waters came rushing down and took out some infrastructure. One of the things that if you're not there, you don't think of, but there's a significant mining operation. Well, that mine is dependent on power to ventilate all the mines, because if the dust builds up, now you've got a significant explosion hazard. So again, one of those things where you start to peel back that onion, it doesn't take too many layers to figure out that, holy crap, we got to get that restored there, because now we're going to have another disaster on our hands. So being able to go really get community focused throughout the Commonwealth to identify what are the particular needs, and then be able to answer that call when it comes by, we can, that's where we would really love to see it go, to have, like I said, just a large amount of that capability while the grid's being brought back up online.